Happy New Year, everyone! To mark the occasion, here's my review of Wolfenstein 2: The New Colossus for PC, Xbox One, and PlayStation 4, although a Nintendo Switch version is in the works. What you're seeing here is the PC version. This is a first-person shooter and the sequel to Wolfenstein: The New Order. It was developed by Machine Games and published by Bethesda Softworks in October of last year for PC, Xbox One, and PlayStation 4, and it's set to release on Switch later on this year. Generally speaking, on the game's launch, it was very well received, and it went on to win the Best Action Game at the Game Awards for last year, although frankly the Game Awards are pretty much a joke, so I wouldn't say that it really carries much weight behind it. Although even though it was well received on launch, it actually generated a fair bit of controversy with its advertising campaign, which was honestly quite obnoxious. I don't care what political affiliation you decide to have on this particular argument, but you really can't ignore that the advertising campaign for this was taking full advantage of a very hostile political environment and very clearly planting itself on one particular side and just kind of running with it. But here's the thing. An advertising campaign is almost completely independent of the game itself. I mean, look at Daikatana's advertising where it was like John Romero's about to make you his bitch. But that's neither here nor there, and this video is really not the place for a political argument. What it really is about is assessing the game on its own merits and faults and determining whether or not it's actually worth playing. So, let's go ahead and get right into it. And as usual, we'll start with the presentation. This does run on id Tech 6, which is the same engine that powered Doom 4, so it's a very reasonably performing engine for the most part, although admittedly I am running a GTX 1080, 16 gigs of RAM, and an i7-4790K, so your mileage may vary if your system is weaker or more powerful than mine. I have seen numerous reports of people having lots of issues with the game running like absolute garbage on their rigs, and their rigs aren't necessarily the weakest around or anything. So it seems like it's a bit of a crapshoot as to whether or not the game is going to run well on your system. Now, I didn't really have any issues with frame rates at all, but I did run into some very severe stability issues. By the time I finished the game, it had crashed no less than 20 times, and that includes both hard crashes where it gives an error message saying the game has stopped working and cannot be recovered, and soft crashes where the game just stopped responding to any inputs, it went to a black screen, and there was absolutely nothing I could do except go out of the game and manually close down the process. Now obviously your mileage may vary on that, but given that I didn't really have any major technical issues with Doom 4, I doubt it's actually a matter of the engine and it's more of the way the game's programmed. I'm not entirely sure what causes the stability issues in the first place either, because it seemed to happen quite at random. Sometimes I'd be in the middle of a firefight and all of a sudden the game would crash. Sometimes I would be trying to alt-tab in order to answer some messages and it ended up just crashing the game. Sometimes I would alt-tab and it would work just fine. It was all over the place. And that lack of consistency was what was ultimately really concerning about it. But now that we've got performance and stability issues out of the way, let's actually talk about the visuals themselves, which generally speaking are quite high quality. It's got excellent modeling, the animations are generally excellent as well, down to the facial animations looking excellent in cutscenes, although when you're actually in-game they don't look quite as good. That's never really all that much of a problem because, let's face it, you're not going to be paying too much attention to the facial animations when you're actually running around shooting stuff. Although it can be noticeable during the numerous segments where you're not shooting anything, but I'll get to those more in a moment. But beyond all that, the texture quality is generally pretty solid, although it is noticeably weaker than games like, say, Battlefield 1. I'm not really sure what it is with id Tech and the way that it handles textures as of late, but they aren't particularly high res, or at least they don't seem to be. That's not to say that the textures are bad, it just means that compared to basically the gold standard as far as visuals go, they do fall pretty short, which is a bit disappointing for an id Tech game. That said, the particle effects, the explosions, the blood spurts, and all that sort of thing look absolutely fantastic, so they do compensate in that regard. But then you move over into sound design, and that's where things get a bit messier. On the one hand, the game has very strong voice acting across the board, whether they're speaking German or English, although there was at least one instance where the German voice acting was pretty terrible, although to be fair, it was American characters speaking German and not being very good at it, so I guess it worked out okay thematically. Similar to the voice acting being very strong, the music in this game is actually excellent as well. Mick Gordon returns to do the soundtrack for this one, and unlike in the previous game, which was basically nothing but dubstep, this time there's actually quite a lot of rock music, and it works extremely well. I guess that just goes to show that when Mick sets his mind to it, he can make a good soundtrack. Now that said, there is a rendition of Twisted Sister's We're Not Gonna Take It that plays during the end credits, and while that's a good song in its original form, and the Twisted Sister version is still very enjoyable to this day, whoever designed the cover that was used in Wolfenstein 2: The New Colossus should be punished for their crime against music by being locked in a cell, the key being thrown away, and the rest of their miserable existence being nothing but listening to the Extreme Paint Brawl soundtrack on endless loop. Seriously, whoever is responsible for that atrocity should be utterly ashamed of themselves. But with the music out of the way, we come to the sound effects, and they're all incredibly wimpy. There's basically no bass kick behind any of the weapons in this game, and the explosions sound like dull thuds. In fact, there were many times where I was sitting there trying to figure out where I was being shot from, and I actually couldn't hear the shots, even though the enemy was right next to me. That is how muted and wimpy the gun sounds are in this game, and frankly, it's just a downright travesty. A game like this really needs beefy sound effects to give you that really visceral, satisfying combat feel, and unfortunately they just don't have them. So really the best way to sum up the presentation is that it's a bit of a mixed bag. On the one hand, it does have some rather strong elements, but there's certain other elements that really do drag it down. But here's the thing. What really matter in a video game are the story and the gameplay. And quite honestly, I can sum that all up with one simple statement that was my first reaction to the game, and it was ultimately my reaction after I had finished the game. And it was as follows, and I quote, "What in the unholy fuck have you done to Wolfenstein?" This is similar to the phrase I would utter numerous times throughout the course of the game when it came to the writing department, which is, "Machine Games, what the fuck is wrong with you?" Both of those things out of context probably sound very harsh, but the problem is that in order to adequately explain why I came to those conclusions, I have to spoil the entire game for you. So consider this your official spoiler warning. I will have a timestamp displaying on the screen right now showing you when you can skip to in order to skip straight to the gameplay section and avoid the spoilers for the story. And now that you have been adequately warned, and those of you who do not want spoilers have probably skipped ahead, let's go ahead and talk about the story. So like in Wolfenstein: The New Order, you play once again as BJ Blazkowicz, and this takes place really directly after the events of Wolfenstein: The New Order, where BJ suffered severe injuries during his fight against Death's Head and the resulting destruction of Death's Head's lab. He's rescued by his friends in the Kreisau Circle, and they try to nurse him back to health as best they can, and while he's recovering, he's going through various fever dreams, effectively, of his past. And Machine Games, in their infinite wisdom, decided that the best way to start a story in a game that has Nazis having a moon base, and you find out later on, a base on Venus, along with all kinds of other ridiculous crap that you see throughout both The New Order and, of course, this game, is to show very long, unskippable cutscenes featuring his horrendously abusive, racist, sexist, anti-Semitic father smacking BJ, his mother, and his dog around like they're rag dolls. Followed by a sequence where his father takes BJ's wrists, straps them to a table, sticks a shotgun in his hands, and forces him to shoot his dog. This is the first maybe 20 minutes of the game, the tone setter for the entirety of Wolfenstein 2: The New Colossus. And you know how they follow that up? They follow it up with a section where BJ is in a wheelchair, wheeling around and mowing down Nazis with machine guns. I repeat, they go from a sequence that is portrayed with the utmost seriousness, like they are trying to tell the most compelling story they could possibly tell, to something that would be outright hilariously stupid if it weren't for the sequence that preceded it. This is the central problem of Wolfenstein 2: The New Colossus. It is trying to have its cake and eat it too. They seem to think that they can take moments that are incredibly serious and portrayed with absolutely no sense of irony or self-awareness whatsoever, and put them side by side with completely over-the-top, ridiculous, silly nonsense, or even outright comedy. Not only does it give you constant tonal whiplash going back and forth between these two extremes, but it becomes downright insulting to your intelligence. For example, Frau Engel in this particular game is basically a completely over-the-top cartoon villain. But I'm sorry, beheading your friend right in front of you, then taking their severed head and shoving it in your face, making kissy noises, is not funny. But the thing is, it's portrayed in such a completely ridiculous, over-the-top manner that it's not horrifying either. It's this really awkward, just kind of disgusting moment where you sit there going, what the fuck am I looking at here? And that is a phrase you will find yourself uttering numerous times throughout the course of the game, because whenever the game tries to do something serious, it's ruined by how ridiculous everything is. I mean, to give you a prime example, at the beginning of the game, when BJ is in that wheelchair and later on when he gets in the armor that Caroline was wearing, he never stops talking about how he knows his own days are numbered. He's dying and he doesn't have much time left. So he's sitting there constantly being morose about it, and eventually Anya confronts him, and they have this discussion about his mortality and what it means for them, and then the guy who's big into the alien landing conspiracy busts out of the toilet and starts remarking about how great of a shit he just took.
You don't know that! What, you can see the future now? Don't act like you know things you can't possibly know!
Well, the toilet works.
It's the kind of thing that just makes you stare at the screen, slack-jawed, just shocked that they would do something like that. And with that kind of wild tonal whiplash on full display throughout the entire game, it makes it impossible to actually get attached to anything that's going on. Again, the game tries to have its cake and eat it too. It tries to engage your brain with these various really serious moments that are supposed to be kind of thought-provoking and that sort of thing, but then it immediately transitions into something that is so incredibly stupid and so incredibly ridiculous that you have to turn off your brain in order to deal with it. And the way the game lingers on the gruesome violence and brutality that is constantly inflicted throughout the course of the game really does make you question the writer's sanity. The moment that instantly comes to mind there is at the end of the game when BJ is storming an airship with Anya, and Anya, who is pregnant by the way, ends up throwing a couple of grenades at a group of Nazis, and of course that does a huge amount of damage to them since their guts and blood showering all over the place. And Anya's shirt catches on fire, so she tears the thing off. Now she's not wearing anything above the waist, and she's being showered in blood and gore while firing 2 assault rifles at one of those giant robot dogs. Not only is that a moment that is so utterly ridiculous that it is literally impossible to take it seriously, but let's face it, that's just disgusting. It's not funny, it's not horrifying, it's not even really badass, it's just nasty. And the way the game portrays it, it makes it painfully obvious that the writers were very proud of it, which ultimately leads me to the conclusion that they're just messed up in the head. But here's the problem. Beyond simply being messed up in the head and having that wild tonal whiplash, the story itself isn't even any good. The idea behind the story is that BJ and the rest of the Kreisau Circle are trying to fight back against the Nazi regime, and they're trying to inspire the American people to fight back against them as well. To do that, they need to unite the various people that are involved in resisting the Nazi regime across the country, and then they need to take out a few key targets in order to help the resistance actually fight back. And while they do try to explain what you're doing throughout the course of the game, they don't do a particularly great job of it, and it really does seem like they just took a bunch of ideas and threw them into a blender and said, that's good enough. A lot of the game's story just feels like it was haphazardly slapped together without much real consideration as to how it would work out in the long run, and you end up with moments that have to be explained away by blatant Deus Ex Machina, like the moment where BJ gets captured after going back to his hometown for what is effectively a level of nothing but him wandering around his old ranch and just reminiscing on the past. Because clearly what we want in a Wolfenstein game is a walking simulator. I'm not joking. That's what that level is. A walking simulator. You wander around, you look at things, and then it plays cutscenes. That's it. But anyway, that is followed up by BJ being captured and then swiftly put to trial, which is just a sham trial, of course, and him having a moment where he imagines himself just busting out of the shackles and annihilating everything in his path. And then, of course, he wakes up and they're like, oh, by the way, it's execution time. And if you're thinking, oh, well, they'll do the smart thing and have him be rescued at the last moment by the Krasow Circle, well, you'd be sort of right. Because the way they resolve that is one of the stupidest things I have ever seen in fiction. BJ gets beheaded. The Krasow Circle recovers his head, gets oxygenated blood going to it to keep him alive, puts his head in a jar, and then it's like, oh, by the way, we just happened to have this super soldier body just sitting here. Now, they do tease the head-attaching technology earlier on in the game when the scientist is talking about this, well, creature, for lack of a better term, because it's a monkey's body with a cat's head attached to it, and it's perfectly fine. It's alive, it functions fully, and so they basically tease that technology, and it's like, okay, why is this here? Oh, so they can have a plot contrivance later on with, oh, by the way, we're going to attach your severed head to a super soldier body now. Again, it's one of the stupidest things I have ever seen in fiction, and it actually made me not give a crap about the rest of the storyline, because how could I give a crap about the rest of the storyline? They quite literally just beheaded the main character, but it wasn't that big of a deal, and within seconds he's back up and walking around in a super soldier body. It completely destroys any sense of tension the game could have possibly had. Not that there'd be much tension anyway, what with the gameplay making you an unstoppable juggernaut of death, and really the story itself making you an unstoppable juggernaut of death. And what you ultimately end up with when you bring all of the story together is something that is completely self-defeating. It has incredibly awkward attempts at humor scattered throughout the course of the game, and while some of them are legitimately funny, most of them are just weirdly out of place. That tonal whiplash I mentioned just constantly gives you problems throughout the entire course of the game, and it becomes utterly impossible to get attached to anything that's going on in the plot or any of the characters and what they're going through. But then on top of that, there's numerous moments throughout the game where something outright disgusting happens, or it tries to shove a message in your face. I have seen numerous people complaining that this game basically panders to SJWs, and honestly it does. There are numerous moments in the game where something that is blatantly out of place but clearly meant to send a political message will happen, and it just ends up feeling horrendously shoehorned in. I mean, okay, we get it. Nazis are evil and they're going to do evil things. We accept that that's going to happen, and we accept that there's going to be things associated with that. But why is fat shaming worked into the plot at the beginning of the game and then completely forgotten about for the rest of the game? Why does the game simultaneously have a character that's straight out of a blaxploitation film but also tries to shove anti-racism messages down your throat? Why is there a conversation in the game about the paradox of using the term having balls to describe someone as having a lot of courage, when in reality balls are very easy to damage? Look, I don't care what your political persuasion is or how you feel about those topics in general, but they really do not belong in a Wolfenstein game. Machine Games, listen to me and listen to me well. You really need to rein in your writing team, because what they have created here is a complete mess. They need to be focused, and they need to be working on things that actually serve the plot, instead of just shoehorning in whatever the hell they want. Second thing, drop the political soapbox. It has no place in a Wolfenstein game. If you want to experiment with political bullshit, go and create your own series and let the political bullshit stay in that. Do not let it infest Wolfenstein. Wolfenstein is not supposed to be political, it's supposed to be mindless entertainment. Speaking of mindless entertainment, do not let your writing team go so far into mindless that it becomes insulting to our intelligence like you've accomplished with this. That falls under the purview of reining your writing team in, but it is still worth mentioning. And the third and most important thing is to focus on the gameplay, because that is simultaneously where Machine Games has done its best and some very, very bad work as well. I'll start with the good, the shooting mechanics. They're pretty solid for the most part. All of the weapons seem like they have some impact behind them. I mean, you can do some pretty serious damage with a lot of them. Hell, even the basic pistol will occasionally make an enemy's head burst into a shower of blood and gore. It's a nice, satisfying effect on target. Even the takedowns are pretty satisfying because they're not only gruesome, but you seem to have quite a bit of impact behind them. Of course, the sound effects for all of that could be a lot better, but hey, at least the actual effect on target seems to be very effective. Thing is, it needs to be a bit better balanced because the game implements an upgrade system where you can get upgrade kits as you wander around the various levels, and you can use those to attach different things to your weapons. So for example, you can stick a scope on the assault rifle and then it becomes a marksman rifle in addition to an assault rifle, and you can toggle between the modes. If you attach a rotor to the Schockhammer, then you will find that it's now a shotgun that blasts all three barrels at the same time. Things like that are really cool and do enhance the capabilities of your various weapons. But you need to be careful with it because you might end up with a situation like the laser rifle, which if you upgrade that to have the charge shot, will basically take down about anything in the game in either 1 to 4 hits. The only time I noticed that it went over that was when I was fighting what is considered to be the final boss of the game. When you make one weapon so ridiculously good that it pretty much precludes using everything else, you've got a pretty serious problem. The only real downside there is that you don't really have a lot of ammo just scattered around the levels to be able to use with that thing, so you have to go find a charge point and leave yourself vulnerable while you charge it back up in order to actually get more ammo for it. The heavy weapons are handled in pretty much the same way. You either have charge points that you can find to replenish your ammunition, or you can pick up a duplicate of the same type of item from a corpse. The difference there, of course, being that the laser rifle can be dual-wielded with any other weapon that you've got, and on top of that, it actually has you moving at full speed as opposed to the heavy weapons, which make you move very, very slowly. That said, the Übergewehr is incredibly satisfying to use because it's basically a singularity cannon, and singularity cannons are always fun. But I digress. All of the weapons feel satisfying to use, and whenever you're in a pitched battle, an all-out slugfest with the various characters you're fighting, it ends up being a very enjoyable experience. Here's the problem. That doesn't happen all that much. Instead, the game is constantly taking control away from you for either an unskippable cutscene, a skippable pre-rendered cutscene that will leave you utterly clueless as to what's going on if you decide to skip it, or it'll put you into a segment that you technically can go guns blazing, but is really a terrible idea if you're playing on anything but the lowest difficulty settings. In those instances, the stealth system comes into play, and the stealth in this game is frankly just garbage. It consists of, are you crouched? If so, you are now in stealth. If not, you are not in stealth. And that's pretty much it. You can sneak up behind an enemy and do a stealth takedown, or you can even do a combat takedown. If you're in the middle of a fight and you run up to an enemy and press the melee button, you'll just do a takedown on them instead. And there are a couple of weapons in the game that do have suppressor options that you can upgrade, but beyond that, there's not really a whole lot you can do as far as sneaking around goes. You basically just stay out of an enemy's line of sight and try not to make any noise. Just, in other words, don't shoot anybody. Just sneak up behind them and do stealth takedowns, or use suppressed weapons to take them down from a distance, or you can throw a hatchet at them, which will be an instant kill if you hit an unarmored portion of their body. Otherwise, it'll bounce off of them and maybe will knock the armor plate off, but beyond that, it'll just harmlessly fall to the ground. And here's the thing, the reason that you'll be forced into stealth more often than not is because the enemy will have commanders who can call in reinforcements. And if they're calling in reinforcements, it's an infinite stream of reinforcements as long as those characters are alive. So you either fight your way through a horde of enemies that just continuously replenishes itself, or you sneak around, you take out the commanders, and then you actually have a normal gunfight instead. If you take the head-on approach, then generally speaking things aren't going to go well for you, and if you take the stealthy approach, then frankly it's just boring. The stealth system is just so ridiculously bare bones that it's really impossible to get any joy out of it. It's not like playing, say, Splinter Cell or Thief, or even Dishonored, which is a lightened version of that sort of thing, where you have numerous tools available to you to really emphasize sneaking around, because there's no such equipment or opportunities in Wolfenstein 2: The New Colossus. So you have a combat system that is ultimately very satisfying, but is unfortunately very unbalanced, making it either too easy or too difficult, because if you play on the higher difficulties, then you just take a lot more damage. The enemies don't really get any smarter. And that's unfortunately intertwined with an extremely bare bones, really barely even functional stealth system that encourages you to play slowly and methodically instead of just letting loose and having fun like the combat system really expects you to do. On top of that, they introduce a stomp ability when you get the power armor, which I used maybe once, I think, and never again because otherwise it was pretty much completely useless. Or they introduce the constrictor harness, which allows you to get into very tight and closed spaces and move through those. Or you get the battle stilts, which are pretty much as boring as they sound. And then there's the ramshackles, which allow you to sprint into enemies and structures and knock them over. And unfortunately, all four of those things are very underutilized, because like I said, I maybe used the suit ability once, and while I did use the constrictor harness a fair bit, it didn't really enhance the gameplay experience much at all. There was always a way around an obstacle, whether it be from the constrictor harness, or the battle stilts, or the ramshackles. Regardless, a solution was presented at every single turn, so it didn't really matter. What's that? You're wearing the constrictor harness? Well, you better believe there's either going to be a pipe or some sort of duct or something along those lines that you can crawl through. If you're using the ramshackles, well, there's going to be some degree of a thing you can ram through. And if there's battle stilts, well, you can just use those to get to higher locations and get around the obstacle anyway. And when you bring everything together, what you find is a game that's ultimately a self-defeating mess that only has fleeting moments of enjoyment. I mean, it's really difficult to enjoy the game when it's giving you constant tonal whiplash. It's throwing in lots of these throwaway moments that really mean absolutely nothing in the grand scheme of things, and we're clearly trying to pander to specific audiences. And it seems like it can't decide whether it wants to be a crappy stealth game or an actually pretty decent first-person shooter, so it just kind of stays somewhere in the middle and ends up doing neither of them justice. And on top of that, why is there so damn much story in a Wolfenstein game? Out of the roughly 9.5 hours that I spent messing around with the game, maybe 40-45% of that was cutscenes, whether that be pre-rendered or in-game. Is this supposed to be a Wolfenstein game or Metal Gear Solid? Because honestly, I couldn't tell at that point. As of Wolfenstein 2: The New Colossus, it has become abundantly clear that Machine Games does not really know how to handle the series. There are certain elements that they absolutely nail, but it seems like they don't want to actually go those routes and instead try to focus on things that nobody really wants. I don't think people really want to play a stealth game when they play Wolfenstein. I think they want to play a run-and-gun shooter for the most part. And when the game is doing that, it generally works very well. But then it constantly tries to shove a really terrible story down your throat, and it constantly tries to shove these moments in where you pretty much have to sneak around, and the stealth system is just not remotely satisfying. So moving forward, they either need to desperately improve the stealth system, or they need to minimize it, because what they did instead was expand it without actually improving it any. And what you end up with as a result is a game that seems like it doesn't really know what it wants to be. Does it want to be a shooter? Maybe. Does it want to be a stealth game? Maybe. Does it want to be a walking simulator? Well, sometimes it even wants to do that. Does it want to just sit there and tell a compelling story, or does it want to be completely ridiculous? Well, it seems like they can't commit to either of those things and don't really know what to do with it. But you know what? At least they put in an arcade machine in the game that actually has the original Wolfenstein 3D in its entirety in there, although it did undergo a reskin to fit the theme of the game, so that was fairly amusing. But beyond that, there's not really a whole lot on offer here. Once you beat the story, there's not really anything to do. I mean, you can go back and go through the Enigma codes, which are a really basic puzzle, in order to get these various missions to take out various commanders. But if you're not doing that, then you're just going to be messing around with one of the DLCs if you have them. Now, I will cover the DLCs in a separate video, but that'll be after all of those DLCs are out and I can compare them all fully. But as for the base game, it alternates wildly between an absolutely infuriatingly terrible storyline and actually pretty solid gunplay. But that's only when it lets you run around and shoot stuff. And ultimately, it was so thoroughly miserable to play through the game that I actually can't give this thing anything higher than a 1 out of 5. Hopefully Machine Games learns a valuable lesson. This is what happens when your writing is terrible and you bank almost the entirety of the game on it. Thanks for watching.